Okay, then today what we're going to do is control and complementation. Okay, and this is a part, or these are phenomena that LFG is extremely famous for. What we will do next time, or maybe we'll start it this time if we get this far, is long distance dependencies. And for those of you who have done other syntax theories, this is usually done via movement. LFG doesn't assume any kind of movement anywhere in its trees. Trees are what they are. Dependencies are what they are. And so this is one major place where LFG sort of has its own profile and where it does extremely well. The basics of control and complementation were worked out in used to be the purple book, still is purple mostly here, in an article by Joan Bresnan, which is called Control and Complementation, and it's 100 pages long, over 100 pages long, if you get into the subject. Feel free. This is what the standard theory of control in LFG is based on, and that's what I will be teaching you, the standard theory, again. This was done in 1982. And there have been a series of papers in the last few years in the LFG conferences that have been trying to update the theory a little bit, point out where there is some flaws, not flaws, but some inconsistencies, or trying to think about it a little bit differently. So again, this is a possible topic for you to look at in your term papers. Okay, I'll tell you what it is first, but just to alert you right now, there are a series of papers out there that have been discussing about what the best way to deal with control is. Okay, so let's start with complementation in general. So far we have had things where we've had a verb that takes NP arguments. Okay, so that's what we've had. We've had transitives, intransitives, ditransitives. So something like I believe you. In this case, they're both pronouns, or Kim believes Sandy. A few of you in your homework 1 noticed that Kim and Sandy could be either gender. Yeah, some people decided they were male, some people noticed they were either. Kim and Sandy are standardly taken in linguistic English examples to be gender neutral. Okay, so that's why I always have them too. They are names for either men or women. Okay, so what we have here is an NP and an NP. But we can also say things like Kim believes that, who should we take now? We'll have to take Peter. Is a magician. Okay, so here we still have an NP argument. This is the subject. But in this case, we have something that is called a clausal complement. And generally, this type of thing is called a CP for complementizer phrase. Okay? You guys should all know things like this. It's a complementizer phrase. It's finite. And in terms of phrase structure rules, I'll do the LFG version. It would look something like this, or if we're doing IP, something like that. Okay? So there's major linguistic theories, especially in the generative framework, about the structure of CP, etc., etc. For us, what's important is that this is a that. Okay, this will work out to be that. And then the rest of it is is a finite clause. So it works exactly like finite sentences work generally. So however you analyze them, as an IP, as an S, whatever, that's how they work. Okay? So that should be... Questions about that? No. Everybody knows about these. Okay, so let's draw a C structure tree for this. And we'll stick to the approach that Mary Dalrymple has in her book. So this would be something like NP Kim, and then we have an I bar, but no I, a VP believes, and then it takes a CP, right? And then we have a C is that. And then we have an IP. And who's our subject? Peter. Believes. And then we would have again a VP. V would be is. And the NP would be a magician. Okay, any quarrels with that? Does that make sense? Okay, now let's think of the functions of these things. This is your subject, our subject, standard. These are the heads. This is the head of the entire sentence. What should this be? Oh, that's not a fair question to ask you. In LFG, this is generally thought of as the comp. Okay. Basically, you can think of a comp as a sentential object. And some of the more recent papers, they are entitled things like How to Get Rid of Comp. So what people have tried to argue is that, in fact, this should not be called comp, this should be called object, just like any other object. It's just a sentential object. So there's a stream in LFG there where people are trying to argue for this. So there's a few adherents, but the standard theory is still that you call this comp. Okay, and then how about the rest? This is a head. This is the main sentential information. This is the subject of the embedded clause. This is the head of the embedded clause, and this is the, what's this? The magician? The object, yeah. Okay, now what do we have generally? I'll give you lexical entries for beliefs. We will have something like this is a verb, and the verb will have as predicate, predicate is equal to believe, and then it needs a subcat frame. What will the subcat frame be? How many arguments does it have and what kind?
Subject and comp.
Yeah, a subject and a comp. And then we'll have things like up, subject, what is it? Number is equal to singular. Up, subject, person is equal to 3. And ups tense is equal to present. Okay. How about, so you need that one. This one will just have a subject and an object under this analysis, and the other one that is new will be that. That we will treat as a C, and in this case there's not much this is doing. We'll just register it as comp form equals that. Okay. So all the other lexical entries should be familiar to you with the nouns, etc. Okay, then let's try to see what the F structure would look like. You've got all the information now there to know what the F structure would look like. So I'll take dictation. Who wants to start me out? Pred, so the top pred will be believe. And it has a subject and a comp. Okay. And the subject, and what else does it have in there? We might as well get done with all of this. Tense present. And it has a subject. And of that subject, we know that the number is singular. And the person is 3. Okay, so that's believe. What else do we have? So that's all the information I put in there that I have here in this lexical entry. Next. Comp. There's a comp. Yeah, that's true. I forgot the comp. We don't know anything about the comp yet, other than believe wants one.
So the comp also has a pred?
Yeah, the comp has a pred. B. And in this, I've just said subject-object. This B is actually a so-called copular verb, and there is also a raging debate on how to do these copular verbs, with me on one side and several other people on other sides. So you can read all about that as well. If you're into copular verbs, you can enter that debate or look at, there's 3 or 4 papers by now. talking about that. But for us, I don't want to get into this issue too deeply, so we'll just say it has two arguments. We'll call them subject and object. Okay. But copular verbs cross-linguistically are quite interesting creatures as well. Okay, what else? This itself has a subject, and the subject is, who did we say? Peter, right? Peter, and he will be number singular, person 3, and all that information that we have about Peter, case nominative. Okay, and there's an object in there, and the object here is pred magician. And all that information as well, singular, person 3, case accusative. Okay, and we're missing a bit of information. Right, we're also missing that this is actually, that there's a comp form here. That's this part. That's just being introduced at the same level as the pred be, right? So is the head coming up to here, and then this comp form is up there as well. Okay, what else? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is it really correct that the magician is accusative? Because he is.
That's right. This is the. Yeah, so this is why copula are different. Yeah. So in English you can't tell. So Peter is him. I think in English it is accusative.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you can say things like Peter is him, Peter is he.
Yeah.
It's difficult to tell.
It is me.
It is me. Yeah, but me and I is difficult as well because you have hypercorrection. So usually the copular verb doesn't. It's usually it depends. So it often is two nominatives, etc. Okay, so let's take that out then. Okay. Yeah.
It'll be both. How are you going to differentiate? So how are you going to write it up?
How can we differentiate which one is which? Well, in English you have position.
I mean, yeah, but what do you write in that structure?
If you don't know, then don't write anything. Leave it underspecified, it's called. Yeah. And in German it's also nominative, right? Yeah, so it's two nominatives in German, yeah. So okay, I should not use copular verbs for examples. Well, good point to raise. Okay, what else do we have? We have Kim left, right? Pred Kim. And this one we can call case nominative. Okay. And this one would also have its clause type declarative. This one will have clause type declarative if we put that in somewhere. In your homeworks you did that quite well. Questions about these? One thing to note about these, one last thing to note about these is that these are recursive. Let's close the structure off here. This is an example of a recursive structure. Recursive syntax. And the way you can see that is if you look at your phrase structure rules, you would have something like IP goes to NP I bar goes to IVP, VP goes to V optional NP, optional CP, or we should actually say, yeah. And then the CP goes to, okay, so what happens is that when we're here, we start out again with the IP, then we can go through our rules again and have another CP. Okay, we have examples like I'll put it over here. Kim believes that Sandy thinks that Peter is a magician. Okay, so what do we have here? We have one CP embedding another CP. Okay, two, and we can also, of course, have more, that Sandy thinks that Hans knows okay, so the point is you can have infinitely many of these, but they're not like adjuncts, they're always embedded. Yeah? So you have a matrix IP embedding a CP, which embeds another CP, which embeds another CP. Shall I draw the F structure for that, or is that clear? The back row is saying clear, the front row. Do you want an F structure, or is it clear? No. It will be in the comp, and then build another comp and another comp, okay? Yeah.
The other comp will be a part of this comp?
Yeah, the other comp will be a part of this comp. So we will have a comp here, which will again have a pred, a subject, and another comp. Okay, and then in that comp you could have, again, a pred, a subject, and another comp. Yeah.
And previously when we did the F structure, we didn't put this parenthesis and up with subject and object. Is it meaningful? Or?
Okay, so I have been inconsistent about this. How have I done it in the past? I've just said subject. Yeah. So whichever way you do it is fine with me. Okay. So, but if you're going to put an up arrow, you need to put parentheses around it. So either do this or do that. Yeah.
That's a quick question about the lexical entry for believe.
Yeah.
Because we started out with a sentence like Kim believes Sandy, right? So are we going to analyze it as just an ambiguity in believe, or are we going to analyze it as believe taking a comp and an object and then both being optional?
Okay. So the question is, what do we do about believe? So the what the entire lexical entry for believe looks like when you have situations like this, which you will have a lot in languages, is that you say, okay, I have believes. It's a verb, And I can either have is believe subject object, or to believe ups subject ups comp. And then you close that with the other curly bracket. Okay, so this means either this option or that option. And you have to write it like that. What you cannot do in LFG is write this, which I saw in some people's homeworks. So you cannot do this. So this is very, very bad. Okay, and you want to know though if we want to have 2 lexical entries or 1. Is that what you want to know?
Well, yes, but partly because it's more complicated, but because you can also have both, as in Kim believes Sandy that Peter is a magician. And then it feels like it's not actually a case of ambiguity, but just sort of having the full specified thing where he believes someone, something, and then sort of the unspecified cases where you drop either the object or the complement.
Okay, so here's the question of Kim. The question is, what do we do with something like Kim believes Sandy that Peter is a magician? And that is more complicated even. So we have a subject, we have an object, and we have a comp. So in this case, what you're saying is that maybe this was to, what there is there's an optional object in here, and that generally you believe somebody, and that the object would be here, would be optional. I believe that generally what you would say is there's in fact a third option where you have believe, subject, object, and a comp, because the semantics are quite different. Yeah. So if I believe something, I don't actually have to have an object. Yeah. So you would actually have a third option for that one. And it's not an unusual situation for a verb to have several subcategorization frames. If we have time at the end, I can show you, or maybe the next time I can show you the big German grammar. And it has a verb lexicon of about 15,000 verbs. And the verb kommen, come, spans, I think, a whole page in German because of the particles, etc. as well. Okay, other questions about this belief? No? Then we can move on. Okay, so now what we're going to do is control verbs. Control. And raising. And we'll start out with control. Okay, the reason why we think of it as control is because we have examples like Kim persuaded Sandy to eat cake. And Kim promised Sandy to eat cake. Okay, so what do we have here? We have, this is the subject. This is the subject, that's easy. What about the rest? This is easy too. Eat has an object. Eat has an object here too. What is Sandy doing? So we need to have a subject of eat. There should be a subject. Should have a subject here too. Yeah. In the first one, the subject of eat is Sandy. Okay. And in the second one, it's actually Kim. Okay, but that's Kim is quite far away, huh? And what is Sandy doing here? Hanging about? Nothing to do? It's the object of promise, right? Okay. And over here? In persuaded Sandy to eat cake? Does it have any relation to persuade? It's the object again, right? And you can try passivization tests. Sandy was persuaded to eat cake by Kim. So it turns out to be the subject when you passivize. So it has to be the object of persuade. Yeah. Okay, so what do we do with this? So Sandy is both the subject and the object here. Sandy is both the subject of eat and the object of persuade. And here, Kim is the subject of promise, and it's also the subject of eat. Okay, so what the one generally says is that these things in XLE are called they're VPs. They're VPs that are non-finite. Okay, so these are embedded clauses, but not like we saw last time, finite clauses. They're non-finite clauses, and they tend to lack an overt subject. I'll draw a C structure. We'll start with the first one. I'll draw you a C structure. Okay, so let's start. IP, NP Kim, I bar, we don't have an I, BP, persuaded, and then what do we have? We have an NP, this will be Sandy, and then actually we have another BP. Actually, I won't do it this way. Let's see. Yeah, let's just keep it simple. So I'll just call this to eat. So usually what one does is one has a separate category for to. Would you prefer that, or should we keep it simple? You prefer the separate category? So you'd have let's see, how should we do it? Let me just check how the online does it, so that I keep it as much in line with things as possible. CD program. So they separate it out. So they say, okay, we have a VP. Again, you can differ on how you do it. And you call this a part inf. And then you have another VP, which is an infinitive VP. Then you have eat here too. And then you have an NP cake. So this just takes care that this is a special type of VP structure, which is an infinitive VP that's licensed by this to here. And then this actually looks the same. Sorry, let's do it this way. Inf, and then this is a normal looking VP. Eat cake or whatever. Okay. Okay, so where before we had a CP, now we have a special type of VP. Let's see what the annotations are. This is a subject again. This is just up equals down, up equals down, up equals down. What did we say this was? The Sandy? Yeah, it's the object. And this is our XComp. This is a new category. This will just be up equals down. This will be up equals down, up equals down. And this is the object, the embedded object. Okay, so persuaded will have an entry like this. Persuaded, verb, upspread is equal to persuade, up subject, I don't have enough space. Try again. Upspread is equal to persuade, and we have a subject and an object and an XComp. Okay, and then we'll have the usual stuff about ups, tense is past. And the subject-verb agreement, I won't bother putting that here. And we also need an entry for to. Part infinitive, and we'll just say something like ups V form should be infinitive, or something like that. Okay, now let's try the F structure. The main predicate is persuade. There is a subject and an object and an ex-comp. Tense is past. And we have a subject. And I'll just abbreviate this. This is Kim. We have an object, which is Sandy. And then we have an ex-comp. And what's in the ex-comp? Yeah. The predicate eat, which in this case takes a subject and an object. Okay. And it has a subject, and the object, I'll start out with that, is cake. Okay, and what's its subject? We said Sandy was the subject, right? Persuaded, yeah. So what we want, and the way this is usually represented in LFG, is we want to say that this subject is the same as this. Okay, so there's a co-indexation. Or in other words, we say the matrix object controls the embedded subject. Okay, these two are taken to be equivalent. Now, this doesn't follow from anything in our rule set here yet. And the way it's done in LFG is that you have it as part of the lexical entry of the verb. So what you would say is that we have this, and by the way, I know that ups object, that the subject of the ex-comp is equal to the matrix object. Okay, this is going to be very important, this control equation, so I'll go through it several times. What this says is that I have an ex-comp. My ex-comp subject is going to be the same as my object. So, what LFG does, this is what Joan Breslin wrote about in her one of the things she wrote about in a 100-page article, is that control relations, they need to be lexically specified. Okay? Why do they need to be lexically specified? I could have written it in somewhere in my rules here. I could have said, by the way, I've got an ex-comp and the subject of the XComp should be ups object. I could have written that in here as well. Yeah, so I could have added something like this here. I could have said, well, the XComp's subject, by the way, should be the object. So I could add that into my rule set. Why don't I want to do that? If you look over on that side, yeah? Because you could have several objects, yeah, that's one reason. Might make things complicated, but if you look at those two sentences right there, yeah.
Because you have different kinds of verbs and some of them choose different.
Right, so you have different kinds of verbs. So promised is going to end up being different. Okay, this one is a so-called object control verb. Whereas this one is known as a subject control verb. And it's very clearly lexical if you go look through examples and examples and examples. So verbs differ. So what LFG argues, if it's the verbs that are different, then put it in the lexical entry. That's why it's called lexical-functional grammar. Yeah?
Do you get crossing this variation, for example, languages where you have a persuade, which is subject controlling, or a promise, which is object controlling?
Okay, so the question is, do you get cross-linguistic variation? Let's put that in the back. Let's do promise, the F structure for promise, and then I'll answer that question, okay? It's a good question. Okay, so we have that. So now let's do an analysis for the promised Sandy to eat cake. So this is easy for me, harder for you now, because all I have to do is change the tree here, say promise. And nothing else changes in this tree. Okay, nothing else changes in this tree. What does change is the type of lexical entry I want. So now this is the lexical entry for promise. And it looks very much like persuade. It has a subject and an object and an XComp. It'll be past tense. But instead of doing this here now, my XComp subject is not going to be the object, it's going to now be the subject. Okay? And everything else stays the same. Do you guys want a minute to make trees? Just say, just see above. Okay, and the F structure will also look pretty much the same, except now this is promise instead of persuade. I'll put it in blue so you can see where the changes are. Promise. And we don't have this control equation. What is the result of our control equation now? Who controls Sandy? Who controls the subject of the XComp? Kim, right? This is what our control equation said. It said my XComp subject is my subject. I should make that blue. Very neat analysis. Okay, now to get back to the question of cross-linguistic relevance. So what has been found out after looking at language after language after language, there's a general rule of control. General rule of control. And this says, so right now we've written it in every lexical entry, but in fact you can derive it from a general rule. If the matrix verb has an obj theta, that controls. If the matrix verb has an obj, that controls. And if the matrix verbs has a subj, that controls. And the way you need to read these is that has a subject but no obj or obj theta. It's an obj but no obj theta. Okay, so the idea with this is generally across languages, if you have a predicate and it has a subject, then this will control. If you have a pred that has subject-object, then this controls. And if you have a pred that has subject, object theta, then this controls. Okay, so this is what verbs generally do. Now, persuade and promise don't work like that, exactly. So those actually need to be lexically specified as exceptions. And which one is the exception? Persuade or promise? Promise is exceptional. So promise works exceptionally. Persuade works like according to this general rule. And there's another. I can do another illustration. Kim wants to eat cake versus Kim wants Sandy to eat cake. Okay, want is a nice illustration of this, because what does want do? It has this as a subject, this as a subject. This is our XComp. This is the object, right? So who's controlling the subject in each case. And I'll mark the empty slots, so to speak, by this thing, by the underscore. Okay, so if there's only a subject, then the subject controls. If there's a subject and an object, then the object controls. And generally languages work like this, but there are interesting exceptional patterns. In particular, what's being talked about recently in the literature is so-called backwards control. The data on this I find are very confusing. They tend to come from languages, Polynesian languages, Indonesian, things like that. So if you're into control, go look at that. Okay, and the backwards control is just from here, it's clear this is the object in the matrix sentence and it controls into the embedded, and backwards control is you have all the arguments here and you have empty slots here that you control backwards. Okay, questions about this?
What would be an example with object theta?
I was hoping nobody would ask that. What would be an example with an object theta? Let me check. Because that is one thing I didn't actually look up. So let's see. Promise Louise to follow. Okay, there are examples like, that's why I don't. They're a bit more complicated, but they're examples like this. No, that's the wrong example I presented. No, I can't find an example right now of that. They're very rare. Okay, and you will not have to worry about them. No, I don't have an example right here. So I can look it up and give it to you next time.
You promised Kim a book to read it tomorrow.
You
promised Kim a book to read it tomorrow.
You promised Kim a book to read it tomorrow. That's not English. No. No. Okay, but I'll look it up.
He promised to read a book to Kim.
He promised to read a book to Kim. That's not object theta in there because let's think about it. A book to Kim. So what is our analysis here? This is subject. This is our xcomp. Read has an object. And this is either an adjunct or an oblique. Let's call it an oblique. So it's just the normal subject control, right? Yeah. Okay, other questions? You can't think of an example for object theta? I think they actually come from German. I don't think you have an English example. But I'll bring one to class next time. Okay, so there's this. So this is the very basics. Now we have to consider another class of verbs. Let's see. We'll try these. I'll put them here. Okay. Kim seems to like cake. Kim seems to win. It seems to be raining. And famous example, there seems to be a unicorn in the garden. The philosophers like this one because there's no such thing as unicorns, so then how can you even say something like this in language? And we can use it to illustrate something here. Okay, so what do we have? We have a matrix verb, always seems. It takes a subject in all cases. Well, does it? Yeah, it does. This is the subject. We can think about it here. Let's do the other easy part. This is an object of like. There's no object here, and this, I guess, is the object of be. It's another copular verb. We'll just call it an object. And in the garden is an adjunct, right? Okay. So, what's the problem with these? The problem with these is that so far, if you remember back to linking theory, if we had something like persuade, we would say persuade has an agent, maybe. Somebody who's persuaded to do something, and then some kind of event or theme that this person has to do, right? What do we do for seem? Agent. Agent go. Yeah, or beneficiary or something, or recipient maybe. Okay, so you didn't mean that seem had an agent. No, okay, I'll take that away then. So what do we do about seem? What do we think is the argument structure of seem? An experiencer. Let's put that in here. An experiencer, maybe, he said. An experiencer in some kind of event or theme, right? That's the XComp. So this will link to XComp. This will link to the XComp. This will link to the subject, and this will link to the object in some way. Are we happy with seem having an experiencer?
There's not really any experience in there, right? There's an optional one where you say something like, it seems to me to be raining. But in those four sentences, isn't really somebody experiencing.
So the idea is that if you say something like, King seems to me to like cake, then you would think of this sort of as the experiencer maybe, but not really as of Kim. Yeah. And then we can also ask, it seems to be raining, what's the it? Is it an experiencer? And there seems to be a unicorn in the garden? Not an agent either, that's not good. Not a theme, that's not good. Yeah. So what we generally, so you don't want to do seem like persuade, because there's something different going on over here. So what people have done is they've called these, let's put this away, this is no longer relevant. These are verbs that are known as raising verbs. And here the idea is that sort of as in backwards control, what you have is you have like, so you have something like, I'll put it over here. You have this thing, this little link, this is something like, if we take the like example, there'll be, let's just call it an agent. So what happens is that you put these two together, and that in fact this thing ends up giving you the subject of seem. Okay, so the idea is that like has two arguments, this one and then another one that is not specified in there, but that is raised in a sense. Here's the other argument of like, and that is raised to over here. Okay, now this is probably confusing. Yes? Also because that board is becoming a mess. So let me draw a generative syntax tree quickly so that you can see why it's called raising. Okay? So in generative syntax, you would have something like this. You would say, okay, I have an IP, and in generative syntax you have just binary branching. So you would have seem here. NP unicorn. Unicorn, and then you have a V. Okay, so when you draw it like this, what you see is that B here has this and this. It's relating two things. There's a unicorn and it's in the garden. Seem is just up here. Seem has this thing as a complement. Okay, past, not past, present. Okay, seem has that as a complement, and there's slots up here for the subject, but seem doesn't say anything about the subject itself. And what people assume in the generative movement-based thing is that this thing then moves up here. No. Okay, so this would move up here. And in this case, we would have the sentence, a unicorn seems to be in the garden. Okay. Alternatively, you could leave that, you could not do that, and you could put in a there. And this there is called an expletive subject. Meaning it doesn't actually, it has no content. It's just there to fill the subject position. Okay, so there's two alternatives. Either you take the argument that's licensed by B and move it up, in which case this is called raising. Or you fill the subject position with this sort of empty thing. There or it. So not all languages can do there or it. English can do this. German can do it, but not all languages. Okay, but the main idea is that seem doesn't actually have, it doesn't say anything about its argument. It says, structurally, I know there is a subject, but hey, I have nothing to say about the subject. Okay, I have no particular information about the subject. Whatever the subject is, that's being specified by this. So the idea is that seem, raising verbs, they have what you call a non-thematic argument. Okay, that means there's no theta role. Okay, and we're going to have to save the LFG analysis for this for next time, because I'll draw you a C structure and I'll draw you an F structure as well. It looks very, very similar, except that the way you write seem then, you say I have a predicate and it's seem and it has an X-comp and it has a subject. And the point is that this is outside of the angle brackets. And this means it's non-thematic. Okay, so this is how you write, this is how you notate the fact that it's a non-thematic argument in LFG. Everything that's inside the angle brackets, it's assumed to be able to come from a thematic role and be linked back to that, if you remember your linking sessions. But if it's outside here, it means that the verb doesn't have a thematic role for it. And so what happens is that the subject of seem, in a way, is raised up. If you think of it in terms of this type of tree, it's raised up from below, from the embedded clause. So that's where the term raising comes from, because people were thinking in terms of trees like this, And the idea is seam doesn't have anything up here. Whatever seam subject is must be raised from in there. So it's raised up. Yeah. It's a very, very classic part of syntactic theory, no matter where you go, control and raising. It's one of the very, very early discussions in syntax. And everybody has to show how to do it. Okay, so next time I'll draw you the F structure and the C structure for these types of trees. We'll go through a little bit more. We'll do anaphoric control in contrast, and then we'll do long distance dependencies. Okay, otherwise we're done if there's no more questions.
I have a question.
You have a question, quickly.
About the copula verbs.
Yeah.
Where can I find the papers?
Where can you find the papers for that? I'll tell you after, okay? Or is somebody else interested as well?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll send you, come to me after class and I'll tell you, okay? All right. Okay, then see you next week.